sensual, dangerous, mysterious, and oh so thirsty. Vampires have been proliferating in literature and media for literal centuries, but they've been infesting our imaginations for even longer. There's a reason why vampire stories haunt humanity. There's something so simultaneously attractive and disturbing about creatures who look just like us but hide a monster within. And if you spend any time in online book spaces, you will have probably heard of beloved author V.E. Schwab's brand new release, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, which is, you guessed it, a vampire story. But not just that. It's a lesbian vampire story, which, as a bisexual myself, the queer, the better, I say, when it comes to vampire stories. But it's not just being touted as lesbian vampires, it's being marketed as toxic lesbian vampires, which I must admit is slightly less appealing to me personally, but, you know, a great hook. Blurbed as a genre-defying novel about immortality and hunger, I for one was extremely excited to be approved for an ARC, and I dove into the ebook post-haste. However, as I started to immerse myself in this narrative, I began to question, is this novel really bringing anything new to the extremely oversaturated vampire genre? And let me get this out of the way right out the gate, because I know I'm gonna get comments about this. Not every book has to reinvent the wheel. I know. Not every book has to come out with a brand new, fresh take on the genre to be able to write your story. Sometimes the tried and true tropes are tried and true for a reason. But when your book is over 500 pages, I do begin to wonder, what is this book trying to say? Do I care? What is it trying to deliver to me? What kind of experience is this meant to be? What am I supposed to be pondering, if anything? Is it subverting my expectations? Is it turning a trope on its head? Does it have some sort of really profound and valuable lesson to share? Is this just fun, sexy times for the fun sexiness of it all? Or is there a deeper message here? And if so, what is it? And why is the author sharing it with me? And are they doing anything new and fresh and exciting with an idea that has likely been explored over centuries in a plethora of other books? And as I was working on my review for this book and really letting all my feelings and thoughts percolate on it, I started to feel more and more conflicted in my feelings. This book tries to do a number of things, and I'm not sure I feel it did any of them to the level that I expected and hoped for. For some more context, I'm a fan of V.E. Schwab. I have loved some of her previous work, especially The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue and Gallant, my two favorites from her. So I had really high expectations going into this, which, you know, to be fair, does make it a bit more of a challenge for a book to meet those expectations, but V.E. Schwab was a proven author to me. She had proved to me that she could write stories that I really cared about, that had this amazing atmosphere, that were beautifully written with these complex and endearing characters that weren't always perfect, but you could relate to and root for going through these fantastical situations. But when it comes to Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, my expectations just really weren't met. And the more I think about it, the more questions I have, the more concerns, the more I just want to talk about it. So this video is going to be me talking about how I felt about this book, all of the things that didn't quite land for me, and why I'm feeling so conflicted about this book that I really expected to be a favorite of the year and go into my Hall of Fame of favorite stories from V.E. Schwab. I'm feeling befuddled and disappointed. So let's talk about it. First of all, a little bit of context when it comes to vampire stories. I feel this is relevant for talking about where this book falls in the pantheon of vampire stories. What is it bringing to the table? Is it bringing anything new? How is it interacting with some of the more unsavory and harmful stereotypes that vampires have brought to the marginalized groups they are often associated with? There's a lot to talk about there, so let's get a little bit of context. Vampires have been around for centuries in humanity's collective nightmares. In folklore, they were once figures of pure terror, associated with disease and death and divine punishment. But literature gave them a somewhat sexy makeover. Still monstrous, but also sexy. In 1819, The Vampire was published, introducing us to what we consider to be the modern archetype of a vampire, the sexy and mysterious wolf in sheep's clothing. But it was Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872 that gave us one of the first recorded Sapphic vampire stories in literature. There is one earlier example of Sapphic vampires, but the piece is unfinished, and the Sapphicness of it all is more implied than outright stated. To be fair, in Carmilla, things are still somewhat implied based on the rules of the time, but it's much more overt in its depiction of Carmilla as a female vampire who is specifically trying to seduce our female protagonist, Laura. A female vampire and her female object of desire. A desire that was at the time considered both deviant and dangerous, just by nature of it being sapphic. Nothing to do with the whole drinking blood and leaving a dead dry husk behind. That was just a cherry on top. From there, the famous Dracula entered the canon in 1897, and the themes of the vampire story as we have come to know them had started to crystallize. Forbidden desire, sexual repression, hunger, immortality, and power, among others. Fast forwarding a little bit because we have other stuff to talk about, we get to the 20th century, and one of the most famous vampire stories of the modern day, Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. This was a bit of a fresh reimagining of the vampire story, not only in its more overt queerness, but also in layering in themes of guilt and morality when it comes to existing as a vampire. Vampires have become a mainstay of dark fantasy and horror, but they've also been bled dry so many times that they really truly are a dried up, dusty husk of an empty corpse. And as I was thinking about Barrier Bones in the Midnight Soil, I really started to think more and more about whether we actually need more vampire stories. Do we? Do we really? What function are they serving? Why do we need them? And what do we need them to say? Now you might be saying to yourself, I don't need my vampire stories to say anything. I just need them to be dark and mysterious and hot and sexy. And sure, fair, especially when it comes to dark romance or romantasy or erotica or pulpy horror. I get it. We can just tell stories because they're fun and tropey and sexy and dark and blend pleasure and pain and fear and excitement all together in one fun, messy ball. Totally. But I don't think that's what Barrier Bones in the Midnight Soil was trying to do, and there are lots of more literary takes on vampires that are trying to say something more than just vampires hot, which, yes, but they're not just hot. When we tell stories about vampires, we are bringing in all of our preconceived notions about what vampires mean, what they stand in for, what communities they are most associated with, and how we feel about vampires is shifted by the society we live in, but also how we feel about vampires can shift how we view our society in ways that you might not expect. Especially in this particular moment in history, as a bisexual woman in my 30s, I am watching the world regress in a way that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I grew up in the 90s and 2000s. Girl power was everywhere. I truly believed that women could do anything, that I would grow up in a world where women not only had all of their basic rights, we didn't even have to say that part, that was just assumed, but also that we would be truly equal and really have access and the ability to do anything. Instead, I'm watching the world slowly forget that women are people. Bodily autonomy is no longer a given. It's in fact being stripped away in the most horrific and disturbing way possible. Support for queer communities is declining. Homophobia and transphobia are rampant. Simply existing in this timeline as a queer woman is quite literally exhausting. So when I hear that there's a brand new story from an author I have so loved in the past that is all about telling a story about queer women taking back their power, subverting gender norms, turning heteronormativity on its head, tackling queer rage, and exploring forbidden hunger. In this current day and age, I expect it to feel galvanizing, radical, defiant. I expect it to have something to say. Enter Barrier Bones in the Midnight Soil. This is ostensibly a book about queer women fighting for the freedom to love who they love, extricating themselves from male-directed and dominated systems. But we don't witness that process. We don't feel the struggle. It doesn't feel real and raw and bloody. There are I must admit, a few morally repugnant men who meet the end that you might hope for in a lesbian vampire story. They're ripped to shreds. Love that for us. But even the most direct representative of the patriarchy that we're given in this book meets his end so suddenly, and it's glossed over so quickly, that I really wasn't given the time to just sit in it and enjoy the carnage. On top of that, 2 out of the 3 protagonists have no real male force of oppression in their lives. They live in a society, as do we all, where patriarchy exists, but both of them are living pretty good lives, considering. And the men in their lives care about them and treat them pretty well, all things considered. Did I need every man in this story to be totally evil and die a bloody death? No. But what I did want was at least one, right? At least one. Instead of the cathartic and bloody storyline of women taking back the power from the men who used their societal power to hold them down, we get hundreds of pages of women victimizing other women. And I feel conflicted on this point, which is part of why I wanted to make a video, because I wanted to talk to all of you about this book and about the implications of it all. I don't expect or want female characters in books to always be morally pure. I find the purification of female characters, the angelification of female characters, to be just as misogynistic, but also patronizing as painting them as sexual objects or a femme fatale with no other layers underneath. Women are human beings. I know, groundbreaking. And they are complicated. Not every woman is the same. There are lots of bad women in the world. There are lots of women who do bad things. There are murderers who are women. There are abusers who are women. There are many, many, many of them in the world. They definitely exist. Women are complicated, and they are not automatically morally superior to men just by nature of being women. That is, again, a misogynistic and simplified view of 50% of the population. However, when I go into a story specifically about lesbian vampires, I don't go into it expecting to be forced to witness women being the victims of extreme violence and abuse on page after page after page after page after page after page. It was a lot, okay? And maybe that's what the toxic in toxic lesbian vampires is for. But I think this is a great case for trigger or content warnings, as much as so many people love to hate on them, because when I hear toxic lesbian vampires, that sounds like a fun marketing thing about, a messy lesbian relationship, about a couple that isn't perfect, about the fact that, they're vampires, so they probably have to murder people to survive. It's not all butterflies and rainbows. But what I didn't expect was centuries of severe emotional abuse, which was then followed by coercive control, manipulation, stalking. And I know it's becoming more and more popular and a bit of a meme to talk about supporting women's rights, but most importantly, their wrongs. And I must admit, I have found some sense of catharsis in reading stories about angry, vengeful, violent women taking back their power in murderous ways. But this book, despite being full of murder, is, again, largely focused on murdering young, innocent women, but also not even all that focused on the whole murdering and drinking blood thing. It is much more focused on a centuries-long emotionally abusive relationship between 2 women. And sure, that is toxic, and they are lesbians, and they are vampires. But I personally wouldn't sell a serious story about very long-term domestic abuse as the very tropey, catchy marketing language of toxic lesbian vampires. But maybe that's just me. Again, share your thoughts in the comments. Now, this book is more complicated than just being the story of an abusive relationship. We have 3 protagonists, and while 2 of them are involved in said centuries-long abusive relationship, we also have a 3rd protagonist, and her story is very much about family and grief and loss and identity. And I honestly loved her story, and I'll talk about it more later because I think there was a lot of missed potential in that 3rd protagonist story. But hers was a story that was told more so in vignettes here and there, in flashbacks, while the story of our 1st and 2nd protagonists was the bulk of the narrative of this story. And I just wonder, are these the wrongs that we're supporting women in? Abusing other women? Murdering other women? Again, I applaud depicting women as morally gray or just, morally evil. with no redeeming qualities, as I would describe one of these protagonists. But I do think, regardless of the gender of the morally gray or just outright evil character you're writing, I have questions about what is being said about the choices they're making, especially when we are looking at a story from their perspective, when they're our protagonist. Is the narrative denouncing their actions, and what is the narrative trying to say by depicting the bad things they do? Depicting women as the monster, as evil, could be considered radical and subversive and valuable, and I don't necessarily disagree with that depending on the execution. But in a story where women take on the mantle of monster from men and use that power to continue to victimize women, and pretty much solely women, for centuries, I feel the message is getting muddied here a little bit, especially in a story about lesbians, because like it or not, there is a very harmful, destructive stereotype about lesbians being predatory. And in this current day and age, in our current political climate, as we watch homophobia and lesbophobia and transphobia explode worldwide, I must admit I do worry a little bit about writing a story that is all about lesbians being evil and abusive and murderous and predatory and literal monsters. Yes, they are vampires, but remember the origin of the vampire story and how it was originally told in literature. Vampires have so often, if not pretty much always, been depicted as queer in some way or another. And for a long time, framing a story as a vampire story was a way to tell a queer story and often to depict the vampires, aka the queer people, as predatory and monstrous and other and terrifying and dangerous and evil, while leaning into the sexiness of the forbidden or the unknown, while objectifying or fetishizing queer sex, only to have usually some random hetero man take them out at the end. And the lore of vampirism, the entire idea that you could turn someone into a vampire, is tied to the fear that allowing your young innocent daughter near a predatory lesbian could mean that they are turned into a lesbian themselves. The idea that being queer is terrifying and dangerous and destructive, and most of all, contagious. The idea that a young innocent girl could be corrupted by exposure to a lesbian and therefore contaminated with her queerness as if it's a disease. Monsters in media are often just personifications of our fears as humans, and one of our fears imposed upon by heteronormative societies is fear of queerness, fear of the other, and vampires have often been used as a stand-in for our fear of queerness and the contagion. Vampires have been, for most of their history, an allegory for sexual predators, and often specifically for queer sexual predators who are predators because they are queer and because they turn other people queer. On top of that, villains in general, monsters in general, are often queer-coded. Again, tying this idea of queer as the other, as the predator, as dangerous and in need of destruction. In many stories, the monster is vanquished in the end, and that is the moral of the story, that we can vanquish the queerness and turn everything back into the perfect heteronormative society that we all dream of. I'm not saying that every time a vampire story is told, and specifically a queer vampire story is told, that it's inherently a harmful portrayal of queer people, but that is baked into the history of what vampires are and what they mean to us, and it's something to take into consideration when you're creating a narrative around queer people who happen to be vampires. And that narrative means something. It means something in the collective consciousness, even if we aren't actively thinking about it while we're reading a vampire story. It informs the way that we perceive vampire stories, and it doesn't cease to exist just because we specifically know that this is a story outright about queer vampires being queer. And again, just like I don't think that women have to be represented as perfect, innocent angels, because we're not, I also don't think that queer women have to be represented that way, because again, we're not. But again, representation and the way that stories are framed and told does matter, especially when they are stories about marginalized groups, especially in a time where said marginalized groups are being targeted. It's one thing to have a toxic relationship between women in your narrative. It's another for the only real relationship we get to see, the only long-term relationship we get to see of any kind, but especially specifically between two women, to be deeply abusive. I just feel conflicted about a narrative that is centuries of lesbians victimizing fellow women where men are largely removed from the narrative. And I know we love to talk about telling stories from the female gaze or trying to avoid the male gaze or trying to decenter men. All for it. Let's do it. I have no argument, except kind of when the story involves, like I said, repeated murder and abuse, because if we're totally decentering and removing men from the narrative, that means the victims, once again, are pretty much exclusively women. And I don't know about you, but as a woman myself, I'm pretty sick of reading about female victims of violence. Feels like almost every book I ever pick up, there is a woman who is the victim of violence. Feels like every time I look at the news, there's another horrifying story about women being the victim of violence or violent law. And I gotta be honest, after 32 years on this planet, I am sick of it. I am so tired. And I would love a story about toxic lesbian vampires where I don't have to read about women being victimized over and over and over and over again and again. Maybe that's just me. I would really love to hear your thoughts, because as I was reading, despite the protagonists being the perpetrators of said crimes, I couldn't help but identify with the victims and continue to wonder why there were so many faceless, nameless young women who were losing their lives. Now, up to this point, I've tried to talk about this book in a more general sense while still trying to touch on the themes and the things that troubled me the most. But after this point, I'm going to talk a little bit more freely, touch on each of the three protagonists. So you might want to leave it here. If you are planning on reading this book, come back when you're done, especially if you like to go into a book knowing little to nothing about what happens and the characters. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I do want to talk about this book, so you've been warned. First, I want to talk about who I would consider to be the primary protagonist of this novel, who is Maria, or Sabine, as she is later known. She is our entry point to the story. She is the first protagonist we follow, and she is the first protagonist we watch be turned into a vampire. Sabine, as I will continue to refer to her as through the rest of this video for simplicity's sake, is red-haired and devastatingly beautiful. She's also cunning, very intelligent. She is bristling at the gender roles imposed upon her in the 1500s, but doing so in ways that felt a little more cliched than compelling. Despite having perhaps the most page time of any of the protagonists, Sabine has very little personality. Like I said, she doesn't like the rules. She doesn't want to marry a man. She wants her freedom. She's stubborn and cruel and self-absorbed. All of these are personality traits, it's true, but somehow she continues to feel incredibly flat, and her character arc is more of a flat line through literal hundreds of pages and centuries of her life that we follow. Sabine in the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s and the 2000s is the exact same Sabine that she was in 1500s when she was a teenager, trying to connive her way into a rich husband. She's always manipulative and cunning. She craves a life of leisure and pleasure and freedom, and she takes to being a vampire very easily. She loves it. She loves the violence. There is no guilt or shame, and there's no coming to terms with her new nature. There is only lust, thirst, hunger, satisfaction, reveling in her new power. No guilt, no regret, no shame, and certainly no self-reflection. I think there was a kernel, a chance, an opportunity of something interesting about her in her human life and in her attraction to her young maid, in her repressed queerness, in her yearning for freedom, but it was told in such a dispassionate manner, and we spent so little time with human Sabine, Maria, that it just didn't land with me. Again, watching a character that had a little bit of nuance, a little bit of potential, turn into a caricature of an evil, predatory lesbian vampire and then stay completely stagnant for hundreds of pages and centuries does not necessarily a compelling narrative make, for me anyway. And perhaps I would have been more willing to accept her lack of nuance if she had been some sort of an embodiment of female rage, a vigilante against the violence and abuse and control of women from men in the patriarchy, a symbol of female resistance and rage more so than an actual nuanced character. But again, she doesn't just target men. In fact, she almost never targets men. The vast majority of her victims through her very long life are young, innocent women. There's an instance very early in her vampiric life where she finds herself in a random barn and she's discovered by the farmer. She then begins to seduce said farmer, and when he falls for it, she drains him dry. On the one hand, yes, this man found a random woman alone, clearly in distress or in some sort of bad situation, sleeping in his barn, and decided that he should definitely sleep with her as his wife is in the farmhouse a few meters away. On the other, did he deserve to die a painful and bloody death? Questionable. But do you know who definitely didn't deserve to die a painful and bloody death? His wife, who allowed a strange woman in her underclothes covered in blood into her home. Did she do it out of the kindness of her heart? No. She was promised a pretty necklace. But I would just ask, if you heard someone knocking on your door and you went to answer it and you found a random strange woman in her underwear completely drenched in blood, would you readily let them into your house? I certainly wouldn't. Would I try to help them? Would I call someone? Yes. Would I let them in the house when I am in the house by myself, not knowing anything about who this person is, whose blood it is, where they came from? Probably not, because that is terrifying. That woman did not deserve to die, but she did, as much as the man who was willing to cheat on his wife with random woman in his barn. And as the narrative continues, there are fewer and fewer men on the receiving end of Sabine's violence and more women, which makes sense. Sabine is attracted to women, and so she's more likely to seek them out to sate her hunger of various kinds. Fine. But she doesn't just have a taste. She doesn't just have a glass full. She drains women dry over and over and over and over again. And again, feels zero remorse, zero guilt. She's not conflicted. This is totally fine. This is not a vampire story with tons of consensual sex and a little bit of blood play. This is a mass murderer, a serial killer of astronomical proportions, a predator hunting down women. And I would say more often than not, these interactions don't feel sexual in nature really at all. Is Sabine a predatory lesbian? The problem is not that she is depicted as an actual literal predator, because that is part of the vampire lore. And again, protagonists can be the villain. That's interesting. But the problem is that she is explicitly a lesbian and her victims are, again, almost exclusively women. And I guess what it comes down to is, what is Sabine's story about? Is Sabine's story that of freedom to love who she loves, desire, sexuality? Or is it a story about hunger and violence and power and domination? And if it is a story about power and domination, hunger and violence, why are the victims so often innocent women? Would it not be more effective at delivering on those themes, on both themes simultaneously, by having Sabine spend her everlasting life repeatedly experiencing consensual, fulfilling, pleasurable sexual encounters with women, and then saving the murdering for the men who oppress them? I, as a queer woman, would love to be able to read stories about queer women, about hunger and power and sex and desire and freedom and domination, without reading about women being victimized over and over and over and over again. So many of those dead women being faceless and nameless, just serving the plot. Why are women always the prey? Even in stories where women are allowed to be the predator. Why are women always the food to be eaten? The innocent, soft, gentle thing to be chased down? I'm so tired of it. If vampires prey on the weak, why are women always the weak? And I don't want to get too into the weeds here, because I do think women can be vampires, and I do think queer women can be vampires, and I don't think that's inherently automatically a bad thing. But again, there's so much historical context. There are so many underlying themes to how vampires have been portrayed and continue to be portrayed, and what that says about the types of characters that we cast as vampires, that I just think it's worth being critical of and considering and talking about. Moving on to our second lesbian vampire, Charlotte. Charlotte, at first, seems utterly horrified by what she's become. And we get a little bit more nuance and a bit more of an arc with her. We know that she begins in a place where she is horrified by the idea of having to kill to sustain herself. She is disgusted and disturbed by watching Sabine murder her intended husband in cold blood. And we know that she gets to a point in the future where she has continued to live as a vampire for centuries, and therefore presumably at some point got over it. And I was excited because I thought Charlotte was interesting. I enjoyed her chapters as a human. We got to see a little bit more of her color, her nuance as a character, as a human. And I enjoyed that. I appreciated that. I was drawn to her as a character. What I didn't love was being robbed of actually watching that transformation happen. We did not get to watch Charlotte become a vampire, come into her own, reckon with and overcome that guilt and shame to be willing to participate in mass murder on a huge scale over a long period of time to continue to survive as a vampire. Despite going into so much detail, moment by moment, to her life as a human young girl on the cusp of womanhood through her turning, we then jump ahead quite rapidly to much further along in her relationship with Sabine, where things have turned sour and she is in an incredibly abusive relationship where she is the victim of extensive emotional abuse from her partner, but also some physical abuse and just a huge amount of control. We witness some of that abuse and the way that their relationship has really soured over time without seeing any of the transition, any of the happy years, any of that build up to that moment. And we watch Charlotte escape her abusive relationship, which should be triumphant, should feel tense and be emotionally engaging, should be some sort of a peak in the emotional storytelling here. And it just fell so flat because we saw so little of them as a couple. We saw so little of their relationship. And again, we saw very little of their happy years, if they had happy years. It was implied that they had happy years. Everything is very sudden. Everything is very jumping ahead, vignettes, short moments, and not enough time. Despite being a very long book that doesn't have a lot of plot, it covers many centuries, and it does so in a very frenetic manner. But okay, Charlotte gets free from her abusive relationship, which is presumably a good thing. But then we realize that Sabine is hunting her down, that Sabine does not want to let her find happiness with anyone else. And when Charlotte finally lets herself fall for someone, Sabine is there, ready to murder them. And despite the fact that the narrative allows her girlfriend to be turned instead of just being killed, we don't get to see her second relationship and a healthier relationship continue over the long term. We get to watch Charlotte murder her girlfriend in cold blood because she decides for her girlfriend, makes an executive decision that it's better for her girlfriend to die than to live as a vampire. Interesting that she makes that choice but doesn't decide the same for herself. Apparently for her, it's better to continue as a vampire than to die, but not for anyone else. Okay, interesting. And this was really the turning point for me with Charlotte. This was so baffling and hard to understand, especially because of the lack of buildup, the amount of times that we just jumped to a new point in Charlotte's story and didn't get to see how we got to this version of Charlotte from who she used to be. Presumably it has something to do with being in an abusive relationship for centuries, but we didn't see it happen. So it's really hard to understand how this is the same person that we saw at the beginning of her chapters. And this was one of those innocent female victims that I really struggled to accept in this book. A woman who fell in love and wanted to get to live a long life with the person she loved and was murdered for it. But it doesn't end there because Charlotte realizes that Sabine is following her and really serious. So she thinks she'll cross an ocean. She'll go from Europe to the US because she knows Sabine doesn't like boats, and she'll definitely be safe and she can find love and be free in America. So she goes to America and she proceeds to have a long string of sexual encounters with women she meets, one-night stands, and for a few years she goes back to check on them to make sure that Sabine hasn't murdered them. It never seems to occur to her that she could just not endanger them in the first place, but at least she goes back to check, I guess, once to make sure they're still alive at that particular point in time. But because she's gone back to check on a couple people for a few years and Sabine hasn't murdered any of them, she decides it's totally safe. Sabine is no longer following her or doesn't want to come to America. She is free to have as many one-night stands as she pleases. So she does. Little does she know that Sabine has shown up and has started murdering the women that she's having one-night stands with. She doesn't know. She's not aware. She doesn't seem to really care. She stopped checking. She's just living her best life. She knows what Sabine might do. She has seen it with her own eyes. She knows the risk, and yet she still chooses her sexual gratification over their safety. Again and again. That's not just reckless, that is incredibly selfish and honestly disgusting. And what makes me even more mad about this entire direction that Charlotte's story went in, from a character that I so related to into and so much was rooting for into this selfish, disgusting human being who just repeatedly puts people in mortal danger so she can have an orgasm. This dynamic of knowingly endangering your sexual partner for your own pleasure is something we generally associate with men. So we're subverting expectations by making a woman be the one to victimize women this way. Pardon me if I don't find that feminist. What is the reason? What is the message here? What is the metaphor? If you know, please tell me in a comment, because I really struggle to contextualize this in a way that doesn't make me feel gross. And just like Sabine never has a single moment of self-reflection, this version of Charlotte never self-reflects on the way that she is putting people in danger. Even when she is confronted with one of her victims, she has no remorse. She is all about defending her choices and how lonely it is and how hard it is to live for centuries and be so sad and alone. While Sabine was an incredibly frustrating character and a character I did not get along with from the first page, Charlotte was even more frustrating because she started off so promising and I liked her so much, and then everything about her was corrupted, which maybe is the larger message, but wasn't delivered in a way that felt at all satisfying or effective thematically for me. But let's move on to the third and final protagonist of the bunch, and my personal favorite, which apparently is a very uncommon opinion from the reviews I've seen. Color me confused. We have Alice, who is our modern day protagonist, and we get much more of her time as a human being, and we also get lots of flashbacks to her life before she goes to Harvard, where we meet her in the present day. And Alice's storyline has so much more depth and complexity than the other two, it's almost laughable. Alice has a story about grief and loss, about family, about the evolution of families, their transformation over time, about being willing to forgive, to open your heart again after loss, and about sibling relationships, about sisters, about that bond, and what that means, and how it can shape you as a person. She's a character with heart and depth and a consistent emotional through line. Her reaction to being turned into a vampire directly relates to her loss and grief, her attempt to move forward and choose life, to live for those she's lost, and to make something out of herself, to make her loved ones proud, and feeling all of that being torn away from her, being condemned to a life in the shadows as a criminal, as a murderer, due to someone else's messy relationship dynamics that they brought you into without your consent or knowledge. She's pissed, and I understand why. And it all connects and makes sense, and we actually get to watch her entire arc. It's honestly beautiful. It is. And yet, for the entire middle portion of this book, Alice is completely pushed to the sidelines as we focus on Charlotte, meeting Sabine, their slow burn, her turn into a vampire, their time together, her escape, and her running from Sabine for centuries. For all of this time, Alice is sitting patiently listening to the woman who pulled her into this mess, trying to justify why she, in fact, is just a sad little lonely immortal vampire and shouldn't be blamed for Alice having her life stolen. And when we finally return to Alice at the end, she's no longer the center of her own story. She becomes a narrative device to wrap up an abusive cycle that she was never a part of. Not only is it unfair to Alice and her narrative, but it's completely anticlimactic as an ending to this abusive relationship between Sabine and Charlotte. Yes, there are in-world magical reasons why Charlotte can't be the one to kill Sabine, but the way it was handled was not only so rushed, but just kind of nonsensical within the rules of the world, and also just, again, deeply anticlimactic and removed from the characters who were actually involved in this abusive relationship and had actual animosity for each other. And honestly, I think Alice deserved better. Something that has been pissing me off about reviews I've been seeing and the way that readers have been talking about Alice is that they are framing her as weak and whiny and a sad girl and boring and a wet blanket, and I just find that so honestly offensive. Alice does have a huge amount of rage, but her rage is different. Her rage is under the surface and always boiling. It's building and building and building, and finally it breaks free and is explosive, and she is taken over by a rage that she has never really allowed herself to feel. And that is so much more interesting than someone who is willing to commit calm, unaffected cruelty day after day after day with no emotional repercussions. Apparently, it was annoying that she was so anxious, or that we had to watch so many flashbacks with her sister. And I just find that mind-boggling because she was the most three-dimensional and to me the most real and interesting character we got. And she's showing a different vision of what female rage can look like, a different form of womanhood. She is a different kind of woman. She has a different personality than Charlotte and Sabine had. But apparently Sabine and Charlotte are the kinds of vampires, the kinds of women that other women want to read about. They're the fun kind of angry woman, and Alice is the boring kind. And I just find that kind of sad and reductive. Alice is probably the most traditionally feminine of these three protagonists, and she is the one most hated. And that does feel a little bit like putting not like other girls on a pedestal and deriding the girls who are kind of like other girls, because that's fine and totally great. And acceptable and actually awesome. And that to me feels like just a little bit of internalized misogyny. Now, I'm not saying if you didn't love Alice as a character that you definitely are dealing with internalized misogyny. Please do not twist my words. But there is a bit of a flavor to a lot of the discussions that I'm seeing about this character that are giving off this vibe, and I'm not enjoying it. In addition to all the other things, all the other dynamics going on in the story that are leaving me slightly unsettled. I think Alice is so much more representative of how a lot of women have to exist in society. So many women feel the need to, or are overtly pressured into forcing down their anger just to survive. Women are not expected to be angry. We are not allowed to be angry. Look at the entire movement about Karens, and please tell me that that isn't just a way to shut up angry women. Are they sometimes angry about ridiculous things that they have no right to be angry about? Yes. Are a lot of women who are angry about things that they should totally be and are allowed to be angry about being shut down by being called a Karen? Yes. I will in fact die on the hill that calling women Karens is misogynistic. But anyway, women feel the need to push down their anger, to let their anger out in other ways. And Alice is that character. She always pushes down her anger. She is not able to be angry, in part because her sister is the angry one. Her sister is angry so much that Alice develops this anxiety and feels the need to hold her family together, to be the middleman, to keep her sister happy. And being turned is that opportunity for her to blow the lid off and let her anger out. But it still doesn't feel natural to her because she spent her entire life bottling it up. And is that not such a common experience of existing in the world as a woman? And because Alice is such a realistic woman, and because that is such a common experience, I understand why women are drawn to the kinds of female characters who are allowed to be unapologetically angry, who are allowed to let their rage out, to be callous, to be cruel, to be messy and angry and toxic and mean, to be bloody and powerful and be driven by lust. I get the appeal, but I do feel like pushing down Alice as a means of lifting Sabine up is just reinforcing this idea that we can celebrate women who are not like other girls, women who have traditionally masculine traits, but that women who act like women are boring or annoying or uninteresting. And that doesn't feel very feminist to me. Again, these are just my roiling thoughts as I overthink about this book and how I felt about it and why it made me feel so disgruntled. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Tell me what you think of these three protagonists. Tell me what you think about how they're portrayed and what that is saying and how readers are reacting to them. Do you also feel like there's a bit of a celebrating not like other girls and pushing down more traditionally feminine traits in the way that people are reacting to these characters? And how do you feel about that? Because I don't love it. I'm not gonna lie. Now, I've been talking for a while. I kind of want to wrap this up. I do want to briefly touch on a few things. The first thing is I am not against the idea of writing a book specifically about cycles of abuse. And I think that this book, this narrative, could be fit really cleanly into an examination of cycles of abuse. I do think that while there's commentary on this conception of slowly losing your humanity through your lifetime, which ties neatly into the ways that first Sabine and then Charlotte turn into the very monsters they were trying to escape and continue to victimize innocent people, innocent women specifically, that over time and with exposure to abusive situations, the abused becomes the abuser. This is a concept explored through the framework of cycles of abuse, and I'm not going to get into it in depth here, first because I'm not an expert, and second, because I've already been talking for ages. But again, I think it's fair for books to explore this concept. Do I think that's specifically what V.E. Schwab was trying to do? I don't know. I feel like I have been racking my brain trying to find central themes and a message and a purpose for this book to exist in the form it does. And one of the few frameworks that seems to fit is this concept of exploring cycles of abuse. But it's really not examined in any substantial way. I don't feel like I walked away with a new perspective. I didn't feel like the author had a particular perspective that she was sharing on that topic. And that to me doesn't feel like an effective way to examine or explore your central theme. Maybe the central theme wasn't cycles of abuse. It's stated that it's a book about hunger and immortality. I also don't know how those concepts are being interrogated as central themes or what is being said about them in this book. I don't feel that this book has a clear perspective. And that's something I'm struggling with. The last thing I want to touch on is the writing, because one of the things that I've been most drawn to historically with V.E. Schwab's work is the writing. I do think that she has a really great command of the English language. I think a lot of her writing is very beautiful in not necessarily an overwritten way, but in a lyrical way. And typically in her past works, I've found them to be quite atmospheric. And that is something that I found lacking here. The writing, despite being beautiful on the surface, is emotionally distant and so dense with similes and metaphors that often didn't quite land for me. Started to feel it was very tiring to wade through. And I love overwritten prose. I often say I'm a fan of purple prose because I just love really lush writing, but there was something almost clunky about the execution here for me. I also struggled so much with the lack of a sense of place, especially in a story that takes place over so many centuries. We are covering more than 500 years, and the scenes that happen in the 1500s or the 1800s or the 2020s feel almost indistinguishable. There's so little sense of time and place that I started to feel like I was floating with these characters in a featureless void, watching them abuse and murder each other. And it just felt like such a missed opportunity from an author who I have seen create such an amazing sense of atmosphere in the past. There's also quite a bit of repetition here. It's a long book and some of the same ideas come back again and again. If I had a nickel for every time one of the protagonists was confronted with two sisters and couldn't remember who was who because it was too hard to tell them apart and they were introduced to them at the same time and never identified who was who, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it is weird it happened twice in one single book. It's also weird that there are at least 3, if not more, references to Orpheus and Eurydice, even though I truly could not tell you how their story relates to the story that V.E. Schwab was telling. Anytime those references came up, they felt very out of place and thematically irrelevant. So let me try to wrap this up in some sort of coherent way because, again, I've been talking for ages. I am so sorry. This book has been marketed as a Sapphic, feminist, queer take on the vampire. But that to me rings hollow when the women at its center are cruel, selfish, abusive, and flat with very little depth or development. Sometimes I like reading from the perspective of a villain, from a woman who is unhinged, from a mass murderer even. But the framing of the story matters. If you want me to engage honestly and earnestly with a morally gray woman, give her some depth. Give her some complexity. Give her conflict and humanity and make me care and give me some themes that are really saying something for me to dig into. There was so much potential in this story, and that is why I am so deeply disappointed. Not only do I know the amazing stories and the amazingly complex and riveting protagonists that V.E. Schwab can write, but this story was also rife with potential to tell a story about the ways that unchecked power, complete freedom, complete lack of boundaries or rules, and immortal life can corrupt you from the inside out. Watching our heroes live long enough to become the villain, that is so compelling. Especially when you tie in themes of your identity and even your memory disintegrating over the centuries, losing who you are. Maybe leaning into these ideas of how trauma can mutate your desire, but none of that happens. Or if it does, it is so in the subtext that I struggle to pick up on it despite yearning with every fiber of my being to find some of that substance, to find the perspective and the point of view. And it left me asking, why was this story told? What is this novel trying to say? Why am I reading these 500 pages over the 200 books on my physical TBR? Why did I watch women be victimized repeatedly? Where is the heart? Where is the redemption? Why is Sabine almost everyone's favorite character while Alice is called a boring, annoying wet blanket? Why am I reading a story that is supposedly feminist and radically queer that seems to present queer women as predators and also doesn't seem to like women or femininity all that much? And if this was just about dark, sexy vibes, are the vibes truly enough? Because for me, they weren't. There was a chance here to say something truly valuable in a time where we really need it. There was a chance here to explore the ways that queerness and monstrosity intersect in so much media and flip it on its head and say something more uplifting, something more inclusive, something more empowering. It doesn't feel like this narrative is critiquing those played out, overworn tropes. It feels like it's perpetuating them. And I'm not saying that every vampire story or every queer vampire story has to be uplifting and hopeful and empowering. Of course not, it doesn't have to be. But there just wasn't enough here. There wasn't enough substance. Where are the themes? Again, what is the perspective? What is the point of view? What is this book trying to say? Because I'm really coming up empty, and I don't want to toot my own horn, but I am really good at pulling deeper meaning and themes out of almost anything. If you're going to give me 500 plus pages of a toxic abuse cycle, I want some emotional consequences. I want some psychological depth. I want commentary on why these patterns exist, why they repeat, why they perpetuate. I want to know what this book is saying about queerness and otherness and power and trauma and liberation. And most importantly, I want the book to care. Both about the characters and the story it's telling, but also about the reader. It felt to me like this book had the potential to grapple with all of these things in such an interesting way, and instead it chose vibes over vision. Hundreds of pages of padding around a core of a story that had so much potential, and that's truly always the most frustrating kind of read. So what did you think? What are your thoughts on Bury Your Bones in the Midnight Soil? What's your rating? What do you think about the characters and the themes, the plot? I want to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? I am so conflicted on this book. My rating keeps changing. And I'm just, more than anything, so deeply disappointed. I wanted to love this so bad. If you also were disappointed by this one, let me know what Sapphic vampire stories worked for you, because this one didn't. At least not for me. Anyways, I've talked your ear off, so I'm gonna go. Thank you for watching. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a vampire emoji in the comments so I know you listened all the way to the end, which is quite the feat, and I appreciate you. But I'm gonna get going, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.